Thank you and welcome back to day 2 of the Learning Science 101 course. And as Julie pointed out previously, maybe a big revisit for some of the concepts for you, but it's always good to reactivate them and dig into them a little deeper. And so what we really went through was the human information processing system. And it's funny, but the more I look at it and look at what's going on, the more I think I wish a lot more people knew about it. It's not just for learning scientists anymore. I have had this thought for a number of years now that if you understand how the brain works and you understand the basics of design and you understand what technology can do, you're really fit for any job. That's sort of at core these days for anything that happens, because you're either designing services for people or products for people, or you're creating policies for people or something. And without understanding how our brains really work, and the presentation I gave in India, maybe I mentioned this last week, was about how so much of what we see in society is still predicated on a model of our brain that isn't up to date. And L&D, for instance, the notion that you use bullet points for training would make sense if we're formal logical reasoning beings, because if we get new information, we'll change our behavior, right? And we would if we were formal logical reasoning beings. We're just not, and that doesn't work. And semi-annual reviews and thinking that everything's in the head and one person could go away and make a decision and it doesn't matter who does it because they'll all make the right decision because they're formal logical reasoning beings. All this stuff is just wrong. And yet we still see it percolating. And so if we had a better understanding of us, we would do a better job. And in fact, I'm planning on digging into that to the week 4 is some of the post-cognitive, post-learning stuff that I presented there that I think is really interesting and important. Anyway, how do I advance this? There we go. So we went through this basic architecture where stuff comes into sensory store, which argues for accessibility, right? It says if people can't perceive it, it's not there. They can't even attend to it. And then we want our attention is largely volitional, but it can be overtaken and we have more distractions and we have to help people focus, remove extraneous detail, help them figure out where to pay attention. Like I'm circling my mouse over attention right now. And so that it gets into working memory. And this is our conscious memory. What's in there is both what comes in as the context and what we're bringing in from long-term memory. And I didn't mention this so much, but a lot of what we perceive as being real, our memory has recreated. We can only attend to a little bit, so we fill in a whole bunch from our long-term memory. And rehearsal will keep it there, but that doesn't put it in long-term memory. It's elaboration that it takes to put in long-term memory. And that's why we ask people to reflect and say, what does this mean to you? What does it explain in your previous history that you didn't have an explanation for before or now can revisit in new ways? All this extra processing, all this connection to other things is so important. Our working memory is limited, so we have to, part of the reason to focus attention and to not put in too much in the first place is so we don't overload working memory. So we have the extra capacity to do the processing that we need to do. It gets in long-term memory, and then what's retrieved, we want to automate the appropriate retrieval for use so that we can put it into long-term memory and use it to do something. So our practice needs to be more meaningful than just recognition of content. We need to retrieve it in the appropriate way and apply it, make choices. And there really isn't necessarily a motor store, but that just is a way to capture the notion that we do have some conscious control, but sometimes our automatic habits, the long-term well-practiced behaviors, which we do on purpose, we try and get certain things well-practiced on for recognition, so we don't have to use our conscious resources, but sometimes we have to be careful that they may take over when they shouldn't. That's as things like stereotypes and bias can influence us and keep us from making appropriate decisions. So what we want to, as learning designers, our focus is to get the right stuff in long-term memory so the right stuff comes out of long-term memory and we have practice using it in the appropriate way. And then we act on the world. So any questions on that, or any thoughts or observations on that before we proceed? We're good?
Well, just an observation, that point about influence and biases, like you mentioned it briefly, it seems really complex. So I'm not expecting you to elaborate on that right now, but it seems like a really important thing that is worthy of conversation, whether now or some other time.
Well, it is. It was Eleanor. She's famed for schema stuff, and I'm having a senior moment on her name right now. But she was the one who sort of talked about these outcomes of schemas. Now, granted, Rumelhart had schema theory and stuff, but she had this sort of notion of our brain filling in the blanks, and warned about the good and the bad. And the bad was stereotypes and bias. And our brains do try and simplify and categorize, and we have to be very conscious of that. In my workshop yesterday, somebody was going, she lived in Slovenia, where pretty much everybody's white. And she goes, it's really hard for me to try and think of diversity because that's not my experience. And yet when I'm designing for, a learning outcome, designing content for client in the US, I really have to work overtime, but it's hard to think outside. And then I tried to make the point about, and I grew up with white male privilege, okay? And it's hard, I'm having to fight against that. And some of the messages I've heard recently, like how young Black kids watching Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek really opened their mind that they weren't limited, that they could be in the leadership branch of an entire ship. And just seeing yourself represented, how important that is. And so we have to work extra hard to try and not let our experience biases influence what our audience sees. We want to play to it, but I argued, rightly or wrongly, that we want to go a little bit beyond what we may actually see in representation to try and make sure we're more inclusive and pushing for the direction where one day this isn't an issue because everybody has chances. Was there further implications of that? I mean, that's granted only one facet of this issue. And
it's just interesting to think about the process of a learner transferring something into long-term memory, and that maybe going through filters that makes that information a different message than was perhaps intended. Again, it's complex, but that's the sort of thing that was sort of on my mind as you were kind of talking through the schema.
That's actually a very good point. And that's one of the times when there is an opportunity for ambiguity and people having different interpretations, that's when social learning really makes a difference. The chance where you have to negotiate this shared understanding and everybody expresses their viewpoints and you see that other people interpret it differently and you agree to think through it. Because you're absolutely right. So much stuff, particularly a lot of the asynchronous e-learning, if you don't put reality checks on it, you're right. People can interpret it one way and it might not be the accurate way. And if you haven't anticipated that, there may be no check and it continues on through. Which isn't to also mention some of the bad things about, for instance, compliance training, which is just cover your assets. A lot of the stuff they show, like bullying and sexual harassment, the way they do it is such that it's almost training you how to do it as opposed to training you to prevent you to do it, right? And if you don't have the right mindset, you could basically take it on board and go, oh, well, they presented a whole bunch of case studies, it must be okay. Not consciously thinking that, but subconsciously just going, oh, well, yeah. So we need to, and that's why I like, there's been not enough attention to accessibility, which really is down at the sensory thing, but also diversity and recognizing the value and the importance of seeing the different perspectives and having them represented and allowing people to recognize that they need to make attempts to really be inclusive in the design and understanding. So I absolutely agree that that's a great point. Okay. I also mentioned challenge, and I like this diagram because it encapsulates both Csikszentmihalyi's flow and Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. That depending on your level of skill, what's frustrating, that's too difficult, or what's boring because it's too easy, changes. And I like that. The flag for L&D. It wouldn't be a bad, I can think of a lot worse types of images to hone in on than that one. It does look like flag, but and this came originally from Csikszentmihalyi's flow and the optimal flow experiences in between. And as you experience things, you do develop skills. Now, this isn't consciously developing it. This was sort of unconsciously developing it, but it also resonates with Csikszentmihalyi's zone of proximal development, because he had the stuff you can't do no matter how much support you get, and the stuff you can do with one hand tied behind your back and blindfold. And in between is where learning happens, where you can do stuff with some support. And that moves as you gain more ability. And so to me, they're really the same thing, which also argues, is to me a great buttress to the argument that learning should be hard fun, that having a pitch at the right level of challenge accelerates the learning and keeps people, it's more effective for learning and it's more engaging. Hello, what have you got to lose, right? Except the effort it takes to make sure you're doing this. And that's part of the reason why I think all learning should have a learning development plan, should have time and budget for tuning as part of the process, because getting this right, our first guess may be pretty good, but it may not be as good as it could be. Yeah, if you just took off the labels and just had the orange, then I like it. I'll have to decide whether that's a campaign that's worth fighting for. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? Really, the second to the last diagram we talked about was this spaced learning thing. And I realized as I went back and reviewed it in prepping for today that I didn't do the build of the diagram the way that I do now. But, starts with a normal learning curve. And you actually do better on the test a little bit, only a tiny bit, but you do a little bit better on the test. But it dissipates really quickly. And as I like to joke, this was your college experience, right? Cram for the test, do well on the test, 5 days later, it's like you never had the content. But if you space it out, and universities don't do a good job of this, they have the opportunity with 13 weeks or 16-week semesters, but they don't tend to revisit stuff. They tend to cover this, and then they cover this, and then they cover this. And sometimes it builds, and it doesn't always. But when you do space it out, you may not do quite as well on tests. You do quite well on it, but it's there later when it matters. And that to me. And then the issue is always, how much spacing and how much practice do you need? And of course, the answer is it depends. It depends on how complex it is inherently, how important it is, and how frequently you have a chance to practice in the real world. If you have a lot of chance to practice, once you've trained to do it, you just do it and you'll get regular activity. But certain things like there are things pilots train for that they hope never happens. But if it does, it's really important. So they do a lot of practice so that they're ready for that, even if it ever does happen. And of course, if you reactivate over time, it will be really strong. And just again, this is another argument for testing and tuning. Knowing the right amount of practice and stuff, so it is there, suggests that, well, we'll make our first best guess. We don't have as good a rigorous criteria for this because we have a problem of analyzing complexity, and we have a problem analyzing importance and attaching numerical values that would make us able to have a formula for this. So it really does require developing it, testing it, and tuning it to get that right. And everybody, it happened yesterday again in my session. I said testing and tuning. They're going, we don't have time for that. Nobody's going to give us. How do we get people to recognize that this is the reality? Yeah, we have a long row of hoe ahead of us, but we have to keep up the good fight for the professional obligations. Any other thoughts or reflections on this?
Just, it's just occurring to me as I'm looking at this. I wonder, and I'm not arguing for any changes to this chart, and I, of course, respect Will a lot, but is it fair to call that normal learning curve learning? To your point in one of the videos, once you've learned something, you're really not going to forget it. So, you know, if we really think of, and I think you have a different definition, but I think Paul Kirshner talks about learning being the persistent change in long-term memory. In this case, we haven't really learned it. We've gotten to a point where we can pass a test and then we forget it. So,
well, the test is some short period after we learned it. So, and it's still there. So we did learn it, but learning can atrophy. So I get your point, and there's by the way, you know, it says adapted from him. So he had everything, but he had that spaced learning curve. He didn't have that quite right, and I fixed it, and he's agreed with an improvement on it. So it was much shorter and steeper, and I said, no, we need to stretch this out. So yeah, I did this. I think I included it in my second book and about mobile learning, and I took his original one and redid this one, and I sent it back to him and said, is this okay with you? And he goes, yeah. So actually, we had a client once license it for some reason. They loved it so much they wanted to put it in their stuff. No, it's cool. So anyways, yeah, I get what you're saying. And in some sense, learning does appear, it's just whether you get access to it, but if it's not very strong, it may be hard to reactivate in context. And that's sort of Ebbinghouse's, and that was rote arbitrary information. If it's more meaningful, it probably doesn't drop off that quick. But nonetheless, spaced learning means it's going to be much stronger when you need it. That's the really important thing, and reactivating will keep it even stronger. So you notice that there's no actual measurements on the horizontal axis. Right? It's indicative, not completely. And that was not original. Okay, well, if there's no more thoughts in this one, it's really interesting. I'm working with a client right now. So the notion is, we know worked examples are superior to practice initially for novices. You give them worked examples, then you give them practice problems. They do better than if you just give them practice problems. So where the worked examples come from, one of the issues is the space of context and the space of transfer. And the notion is, if you gave all your practice as the blue O's, your likelihood to transfer to A is pretty low. Whereas if you give the practice and the 4 red X's, your chance of likelihood of transfer to A is pretty high. And interestingly, I'm working with a client, and we've created resource support for their people to start developing training materials. And they're struggling to get their mind around this. They're struggling to get concrete. They may understand this in principle. When it comes down to the complex things they're trying to teach, figuring out what are good examples that will support appropriate transfer, it's turning out to be hard for them, which is an interesting outcome. Is it hard to grok, or is it hard to instantiate? Is it hard to actually, when you're talking about multiple dimensions, complex domains, to figure out how to map out that space appropriately and find the boundaries that say, this is where it's appropriate, this is where it's inappropriate, and facilitate that transfer. So, and the effort you spend here depends on how important it is and how complex it is and how frequently you practice it, right? But being aware of the span of context support the space of transfer. And I suppose I should predicate this with should have started this last week, that our goals are retention over time until it's needed, and transfer to all appropriate and no inappropriate situations. And really, this is about retention over time. And this is about transfer to all appropriate, no inappropriate situations. By the way, the contexts you see are not just those from examples. It's also those in the context, in the practice problems you have. Together, that's the span of context. So you can give some in examples and some in practice to end up creating all the context they've seen, which will define really their space of transfer. Is that, given that I've just talked about how difficult it has been for some people to get their minds around this, does that make sense, or is it still a bit too abstract?
Yeah, I'm not understanding all of the symbols here. So
okay, good.
Could you just walk through the blue O's, the red X's, how those, why they're in a gray circle, what the white cloud is?
Okay. The white cloud is all the possible applications of whatever you're teaching. The gray cloud circle are the correct applications, because you can inappropriately overtransfer, right? So correct applications are within the gray circle. You might do a whole bunch of your worked examples in practice are characterized by just the context exhibited by the blue O's. And yet you face a situation where you're in the purple A, you're not likely to transfer there. So the O's are contexts of example and practice. So are the X's. But if instead you're choosing the red X's as spaces of context and practice, you're more likely to have success transferring of a situation where the purple A. So let me make this concrete. Give me something you teach about.
Well, I support the development of, taxation. Let's just go there.
Taxation.
Taxation policy, yeah.
Taxation policy. So taxation policy probably says some things like, do we tax food necessities versus luxury items? And then it says what's the relative ratio of those, and which ones are more regressive and which ones are more possessive, and what's the total income tax as well. Besides, so there's sales tax, there's income tax, there are goods and taxes. If you want people to understand, for instance, the notion of taxing essentials versus luxury, if you only did examples where the only essentials were food, okay, we can tax milk products, we can tax, we'll have a low tax on essentials, food, fruit, milk, cheese, and meat. Then if somebody's talking about, should we consider boats a luxury and a necessity, they're unlikely to be thinking of that because nobody's transferred that. But if instead you've talked about, well, vehicles for business are a necessity. If I have a fishing boat, that's essential to my career. If I have a recreation boat, that's not essential to my career. We have to think, but if you've had some examples that are talking about that, when you come to worry about a boat, you're more likely to, maybe we did in the context, we talked about a business truck versus a sports car. And we talked about a freight plane versus a executive jet. You'd be more likely to make a better determination on both than if you'd only been thinking about essentials as food. That's the notion that depending on the context that you cover in the examples, what's the likelihood of transfer? Does that help?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I don't know a lot about taxation, so I hope my example I didn't bugger it up.
That resonated. I'm not an expert either. I just help the subject matter experts translate their expertise to a good learning experience. But that resonated. And then within, like, extending that example, all the possible applications then within taxation, like, you could tax somehow, like you could collect taxes to fix the freeway, but the better approach is to collect a fee and not tax at all. right? So like when you're thinking about policy, that would be a possible application that would be in that white cloud where you would say, actually, no, it's not, you shouldn't really tax because you're going to be taxing a ton of people who are not using the highway. Just tax those who really use it by charging a fee for driving on the road. Is that?
Yeah. Or in California, tax the petrol because people who are driving are using petrol, and so therefore they're paying for the infrastructure.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, but you'd want, you know, when you're going to that policy, you'd want to have had an example of what makes sense, you know, an example of a tax that covers everybody and it doesn't, you know, costs everybody but doesn't apply to everybody versus a policy approach. And you have to choose the suite of examples that provide enough coverage to support appropriate transfer and yet are the minimal set necessary so that you're not overwhelming people with a whole bunch of examples and just killing them with content, right?
Yeah, that seems to be a pretty difficult balance, as it sounds like you're
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the choice, what is the minimal set that will support the most appropriate transfer, is an important decision. And when we don't make consciously, oh, here's an example story from the SME, let's pop that in there. Oh, you know, I just made this one up, let's pop it in there. Good, we're all good to go. Is that likely to support the transfer we need? And if it's rare, or, you know, somebody specialized in that would need to know more, let's put it into a special, you know, some advanced learning for that specialization versus in the generalization that everybody needs to know. And yeah, no, I didn't say it was easy. You didn't take this job because it was easy, right? The human brain's arguably the most complex thing in the known universe. And you think you're going to change it with some simplistic strategy? Change it in a reliable, repeatable, persistent way? It's rocket science. And yet, oh, you know, if you can't do, you teach. No. Okay, I've been on a bit on an editorial soapbox. I should probably get back to the task at hand. But any more on this before we move on? Jolie, made sense to you too? Okay. In what you saw to, you know, in the course of that, was there anything surprising or uniquely interesting in the entire, you know, now we're going generally to the whole chapter 2, basically, and chapter 1 is.
I have something, but I've been talking a lot. So Julie, I'll cede
That's
the
right.
floor to you for.
Go ahead, Mark. Get started.
So I put this in, and anyway, whether this is something to discuss now or not, you can let me know. I put this in the comments under the video that talks about chunking and, you know, no more than 5 chunked elements, which I've heard before. I understand, I like the concept, but, and you'll see if you see the comments, that I think the tricky part about that for me in working with subject matter experts, their chunk, what they consider to be one chunk, is 20 chunks for the novice, or whatever number you want to pull out. And so in conversations with the subject matter experts, I'll say, we really should break it down. And the pushback I get is, well, we're not going to dumb it down. These are smart people. We're working with, like, let's respect, these are experts, or these are professionals that we're going to be training in the workplace. We shouldn't dumb it down. And so there's this tension of me saying, we need to, like, we really need to simplify. What you consider to be one element for them is a whole lot of information. So anyway, any thoughts, especially as it relates to sort of, you know, this human information processing model?
Well, absolutely. I mean, to me, one of the things is that whole phenomena that experts can articulate what they actually do. That 70% of what they do, they can't articulate. That's according to the University of Southern California's Cognitive Technology Group. 70% of what they do, they can't articulate, but they can articulate the knowledge. But to me, that point is yes, and whatever the number is. For you now, it is, you might have to explain a bit of chunking to them, but look, this is now for you one chunk. But for them, it's all these chunks, and you may break it down and show what all the chunks are, and then say, to them, it's arbitrary information. And despite the fact that they're professionals, they can't keep all that in mind in the hand until it's joined together. You might say, give them a task. Here's 11 arbitrary letters. I'm going to give you 5 seconds of exposure and I expect you to reply back all 11 accurately. And they can't do it. And you say, ahem. And then, you could even do the experiment in the thing where then you take those 11 letters, you rearrange them to ABC and NSA and FBI, and suddenly they can remember. And you go, that's what chunking does. You're trying to give them too big of chunks, it overwhelms memory. We need to break it up. And then maybe not down to all 22, if those 2 and those 3 can be lumped together, but you build FBI and ABC and CIA together first, and then you give them the bigger chunks, and you have to let them know that it's got to cascade up. It's not like they can deal with it all at once. It just exceeds working memory capacity. There's several, when facing objections, I like to have a full suite of solutions to hand and adapt to who I'm speaking to. So one of it is I have the scientific argument, the chunking and the way the brain works. Another thing is I have anecdotes where talking about, I couldn't learn this until first I mastered this and this. Bring in a personal story. Think of something you learned besides this. Think about something like, do you play a sport or do you have a hobby? And could you do it all at once, or did you have to first master this and then that and then that? So you get it personal to them. And have all of these to hand. And then you figure out, okay, what's going to work, and sometimes you have to try all of them. And sometimes you have a good sense of what's going to work with this person, but be prepared to persist and help work until they can get their mind around the underlying aspect. But does that help?
Yeah, sorry, I was off mute that whole time, so you're hearing me. Yes, that does. You're probably hearing me type as well. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Anything from you, Julie?
So this is interesting. I'm having a hard time remembering what I read last week. Like, I know it's there, but like having to just fully recall blankly. Thank you. I need a little support to help remember what it was that I was reading about. Yeah, I mean, when I think about this too, I think similar to Mark's point, working with subject matter experts, they just think it's so easy. They forget how many years they have been working with this or thinking about this to get there. And then and so, yeah, I see that. And then also, with the moving things into that long-term memory, that be going from elaboration and then even retrieval practice, and how that's not really there's often no space or time to allow for those things. People don't want to give the time to have that happen, to help move things into the long-term memory. So I think those are some of the challenges I see.
Oh yeah, it continually comes up that everybody's expectation is we run an event and they have magically changed, instead of that's just started the process. It'll be gone in 2 days if we don't reactivate it and reactivate it and reactivate it. And what if we cram a whole day event? They'll be able to give them a takeaway and then give them some step-by-step things. I'm working on advisory board of a startup that's doing some of this learning follow-on approach and they're going, oh, well, every couple of weeks we'll give them a prompt. Like, no, that's not frequently enough, guys. Learning science says it'll be gone by then. We need to do more. So it's once a week at least. Yeah. Which is why I've spaced this out once a week. And yeah, granted, maybe too much, but it also had to be, we had to dance around every other presenter's schedules. And being one of the co-organizers, I let our guest faculty have first choice, and I'm sneaking in after them. But anyways, so great points, absolutely. And the clash between the expectations people have about this and what we're learning is the reality is just a major barrier to success in the industry, because people have this, well, first of all, it only takes weeks. If you're given PDFs and PowerPoints and you can pop it in this rapid audio learning tool and add a quiz and you're done, and that's only going to take you a week or two, right? Versus Do you care about this? Yeah, and they're not measuring. Okay, I'll get off my, you've heard most of that.
Clark, can I ask another question that I'm thinking about
Sure.
now with regard to chunking and interleaving? They feel to me like two opposing things. Because like to me, when I think of chunking, I think of like, okay, we're gonna practice all addition, all subtraction, multiplication, versus like interleaving would be like some addition, some subtraction, multiplication, all sort of together, and then doing that sort of thing multiple times. So can you just talk a little bit about like how the two actually work together, or are they truly like opposing ideas and thoughts?
Well, realize that the chunking requires spacing. You need to do some today, and then you need to take a break. And the next day or then 2 days later, you need to do some more. You can only do so much strengthening in one day. So what interleaving, and you could do a whole bunch of A and then start doing B. But interleaving has you do as much A as you can today and then give you some B. And then the next day it might give you some A and C, and the next day you do some B and C. And so they're not in conflict in that sense. The other really strong argument for the interleaving is if you don't know exactly what's coming, you're pulling from it cold, which is more like how you'll be doing it in the performance environment. So it's a stronger form of practice.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help?
Yeah, okay. It does. So you're actually using them together.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. You're
But
interleaving the chunks together, I guess.
We're interleaving the chunks because we need the spacing for the chunking to stick. And then we use that opportunity to throw in the interleaving, which also is part. So they're complementary instead of in competition.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I really want to ask first, what can you do differently? What, based upon what we covered so far, and we're going to go back and revisit this each the subsequent sessions. Are there any things you think you can do differently that you're planning on changing as an outcome of this? I really would hate for you guys to have had fun with our 4 weeks of this and then go back and nothing changes in what you actually do in practice.
Yeah, I think for me, this is really reinforcing. I think I know a lot of this stuff, but it's reinforcing. It's always useful to hear somebody like you, Clark, especially explain things and frame things, in different ways, or just hearing your language and hearing how you articulate things. And then for me, like we were just talking about, I think my big step is really to help translate this to people who are technical experts in things like taxation or elections or, all these great topics that I help support, who, they might also be university lecturers. So they think that they know what it takes to teach. And, to the extent that I can use some of this to help convince them that there are better ways to actually support learning, that's going to be my big takeaway from all of this, I think.
Julie, and you're?
Yeah, I'm thinking about some of the projects I'm working on. So, and I think I'm trying to bring some of it in. One project I'm working with a subject matter expert who has actually like asked for multiple practice like rounds. I know. And it's because it's going to help him because he gets so many questions, and it's some programming stuff and using Git and GitHub. So he's like, people just need to practice the codes of sending things from Git to GitHub and doing all those requests. He's like, how many times can we have them practice? And so I actually had to put the brakes on and say, well, let's also space this out. So let's not just do it all just in this lesson, but let's make sure we give them, practice throughout. And so I've been trying to build in, but I'm thinking too, I guess, about like the context pieces. I'm trying to think about like when you're talking about like, a programming steps where it truly is just do steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, like that contextual piece, like, are we giving enough different examples? But there also aren't really different examples because you just kind of you just have to do the steps. The different examples is when you do a step wrong and you have to troubleshoot, I guess.
But it might be, to different folders in GitHub and different types of code. And then maybe there's libraries as well as the source code or something. So give them practice in doing that. By the way, this also sounds like it may not be a learning thing. It may be a better place for performance support.
Yeah.
Here's the 4 steps, next time you need it, bring up this job aid. You were talking about, no, was it you? It was somebody else, I think, was talking about. Never mind. But just think about, is this something that should be in the head or can it be in the world?
Yeah.
Him.
I think we're trying to we're trying to do both. So we want to give them enough sort of structured practice so that when they do it on the job, the job aid itself makes sense for how to follow the steps without all the screenshots of exactly how it should look, but just run this command and that should be all they need.
I talk about backwards design where you figure out what ideal performance would be. And if it's them using a 4-step thing, but you don't have to show them screenshots for every variation. So you develop the 4-step job aid, and then you do a little training around the job aid that has them use it to do several different types of tasks so that they then can transfer that job aid to other tasks. And it's a lot less work than trying to get it in their head with all the different contexts and remembering all the steps.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm mindful, Mark, you said you had to go. The last slide, so you can see it and you can think and respond, or you can run away. I know you have to go get your kid, and I'm mindful of that, and I'm very supportive of that, by the way. Yay, good parents. What do you fear you can't do differently? What challenges do you face that we may be able to collectively help come up with solutions that we haven't already? And I know we've done a bit of that.
Mark, do you want to give some thoughts before you head out?
Yeah, and I don't mean to vilify the subject matter experts I work with, because they're fantastic people and they're dedicated. But again, a lot of it, the way that the project I work on is set up, is it really does depend on a really close collaboration with our subject matter experts through the design, development, and delivery. We have them delivering the content. So it's frustrating when you've built in a nice participatory activity, or even just a moment for reflection, and they skip over it because they don't have time. They're behind on their talking points. And so they blow past, pause for a moment to think about how this relates to your work, or what you can use from this, which I try to explain to them. It's a light touch, but it's really a good opportunity for your learners to reflect and synthesize and come up with some questions or opportunities, kind of like what you're doing with us right now. But when I say light touch, maybe they think not important, and they feel like,
right, emphasize, the go to the diagram and emphasize the elaboration part of the process, and that's a very critical part of it. There is one other aspect. John Aleckson did his PhD thesis. He runs a firm up in Minnesota somewhere.
No, he's in Madison, where I'm from, and Julie lives.
Yeah, Madison. Oh, okay.
Web Courseworks, right?
Right. Web Courseworks. He did a PhD thesis on working with subject matter experts, and he then took it and made a book out of it called Mind Meld. And in it, he talks about how important it is that you recognize their expertise in their area, but you also have to get them to recognize your expertise in your area. And if you can't, until you establish that, you're always going to have this sort of subservient role, and it doesn't work. And he had some hints for how to make that happen. But it's a critical part to say, guys, if I put this in here, there's a reason. If you blow by it, you are disrespecting. I hate that word, but I couldn't think of a better way. You're not respecting the expertise that I'm bringing to the table, and you are undermining our effectiveness, and you're undermining your own good.
Yeah, so, Mark, maybe using more formal, like official L&D language. Sometimes I feel like I'll come off as a snob by using it, but I also feel like it adds some credibility if I'm using the scientific terms, and then say, well, and so that means, and then sort of go into it.
Not bad advice. Yeah.
Great. Well, with that, I need to leave. I'm so sorry. This has been a fantastic discussion. I look forward to next week. I assume chapter 3 before we rejoin next week.
Oh yeah, that was the final slide. Go to chapter 3. And next week,
Cool.
oh, come on. Next week, we'll talk about what that all means. So, all
Awesome.
right, Mark.
Looking forward to it.
Great
Thanks.
having you.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy the conference, Clark.
Thank you much.
All right. Bye-bye.
And Julie, you get private consulting.
I mean, I think it's the constraints, like it's the organizational constraints. I think that for me, it's the challenge, and it's navigating those when I know what would be great, and then, well, there's this constraint, and then there's this person who thinks they understand and know, and so I have to manage that relationship and how I talk to them about it. So to me, it's all of those pieces that feel like it gets in the way of, what could be great. And it can still be good. I'm working on that. It's good enough too, I guess. Yeah.
Well, that's it. You advance as much as you can. You fight the battles. You fall back and occasionally just commiserate over a drinky with somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Cheers. But yeah, it's it. Nobody said it's easy, and there's just a whole bunch of bad legacy stuff around learning in organizations that. Everybody's been to school. If it looks like school, it must be learning, right? So if somebody's up there and pontificating and having you fill out quizzes, that's got to be great for learning. And no, don't you remember how bad schooling was? How ineffective your actual school experience was? But yeah. So yeah. I sympathize, and I'm happy to brainstorm any particular specifics, but in general, it's be prepared, have your scientific arguments, your examples, your stories, the personal ways to draw it out of them, and apply as useful.
Yeah, and I think what I'm finding too is sometimes it actually feels easier to have the conversation with the subject matter expert than it does with other L&D people in the organization who aren't following research practices. That feels like it's a much more touchy area.
Because they think they know what they're talking about.
Right. It's their job too, and so yeah. I remember when I was trying to, with a colleague in the past, they were talking about learning styles. And so I thought, oh, this will be a great, let me pull from all of these pieces and give them all the things about why it doesn't work. And what was interesting. This was a person who is very focused on science, but then her direct response was, well, my personal experience is different, and I was like, so I left it at that. And, just kind of, okay, it's not going to go anywhere right now, but yeah, so sometimes it feels like other L&D folks are sometimes a bigger challenge because we're in the same field.
It is a problem. There's a lot of legacy people who have, for a variety of reasons, are invested in these beliefs, and yeah, that's a horrible response. Oh, so your personal opinion trumps the evidence?
Yeah.
Yeah. In this workshop, the leader had somebody he knows give a little case study, and in it she mentioned, and then we do the DISC assessment. I made a face, and my friend who was sitting next to me is another facilitator, sort of patted me on the shoulder, and then I was sitting at lunch with her, and then she goes, oh, and generations, my kids, when they went and did VR, and I don't want to be rude at the table, but oh my goodness, this person's in the span of an hour has spouted, a couple hours, spouted 2 different myths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's, that it feels much more touchy, a more delicate conversation to address when it is someone in the space versus someone who's a programmer, right? they probably understand they don't know as much. And so they're usually going to be a little bit more open.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a challenge. So at the end, I may, if the leader gives us a chance to final points and anything you want to point to, here's my myths book, read it. Here's my L&D strategy book, read it, because it's a strategy session. So I point to that one and the learning science one. But anyways, yeah, you're right. I think our own colleagues may be our biggest barriers, and those above us who have myths about it too.
Mm-hmm.
They still push DISC in business school and MBTI.
Yeah, my organization does insights discovery now.
Another one of these.
It's a similar thing. It's a colors, but I think I was looking online and it's based on, I think it's Young. So it's,
Colors is, and
mm-hmm.
which is a completely flawed basis because he just made that stuff up and he admitted it.
Yeah.
And you look it up on Wikipedia and they say scientists think it's unverifiable. In other words, it's just a flawed basis. But everybody likes buckets and tools and they're willing to throw money.
And I think what's hard is that I think for those, I even struggle to say what the harm is. Like, because it's like, well, I mean, they're kind of fun, so like I get it. But to try to say, and it's someone I was talking to said, well, it gives us some common language to use.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're coming up with like reasons that just feel more difficult to sort of go against, I think.
Well, I had specifically have a harm with some of these assessments. And that's that if you characterize yourself as a blue, there may be times when you are capable of being a green and it's appropriate, or being an orange and it's appropriate. And you won't, because you've characterized yourself as this other color. And that can be a self-limiting factor, along with the fact that, okay, you want something to characterize people that's just fun. Why not use astrology? Mm-hmm. And it's a lot cheaper than paying for DISC or colors.
Yeah, or like the which dog breed are you, or something, like you one of those types of quizzes.
Well, or just what animal do you identify with, and there's nothing behind it. It's just sort of a way to have a dialogue. That was funny. We did this in a company I was in many years ago, and all the guys were going, "Oh, I'm a bear, I'm a lion." I go, "I'm an otter," and they were like, "You're such a wimp." It's like, otters are fun. They're flexible on water and land, and they like to have fun, and they're energetic, and it's like, they'll go sliding down snow. You guys are just a bunch of carnivores. But
Clark, have you ever seen an organization actually move away from any of the personality assessments?
Good question. And no, I don't have that much detailed interaction with organizations. I would be really worried, by the way, with this, any color or MBTI or DISC or anything, if it's used in any way to choose people for jobs, to decide to hire them or not. I literally once applied for a company and they asked me to take the color test. And then afterwards, I said, "You're going to give me the results?" "No." And we also use it to make hiring decisions. That's just evil.
Yeah. So, my previous job, so there must be a company out there, because when I was going through the application, like just when I was just looking for jobs, there are multiples that I had to take an assessment, which I forget. Predictive index, I think is what it was called, where basically like it was a group of words and it said which ones represent you. And then it was another group of words and said which ones do you use like the most in your work. And it was used for hiring. And my boss hired me. And then she actually told me she was really hesitant to hire me because of my profile.
And was she happy with you at the end after working with you for a while?
Well, she was only there for like a month or two after I started, so it wasn't long, but like she talked to the recruiters, and then the recruiters showed her other people at the company who had a similar profile, and she's like, oh, okay, they're not so bad. And like she even told the rest of the team that I was going to be working with that she had concerns about this, and like my teammates had to tell her to not worry about it. So yeah. I've experienced that end of it.
And that's just awful because, you know, it's stereotyping in a very bad way.
Mhm.
And it doesn't reflect, you read Todd Rose's End of Average, where he talks about the problem of compressing people into a single dimension, and there are multiple things, and he gives beautiful examples. And it's wrong. Most of those instruments are flawed psychometrically. The companies that flog them make great promises about them, but you try and find their independent peer-reviewed published research about it. Oh no, it's proprietary. We don't do that. Yeah, because you don't care. So we have a long battle ahead of us. But, yeah. No worries. Anything else? Otherwise, we can send you off to the rest of your day.
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Clark. I appreciate it.
No worries. Well, appreciate it. Really pleased to see you went in and messed with the course and everything. I'm not sure you haven't seen it all before, but
I haven't done the e-learning yet. And so it's been good for me to go through it, because part of me is wondering if I might not encourage other colleagues to sign up and just take the e-learning, just to start planting some of the seeds. And it's not me telling them the science, but they get to hear it from someone else. So
well, they should ask, or maybe I'll put that as a question at the end of the fourth session. But I believe it's really important to experience that phenomena, so then you have a visceral understanding. And I don't know if you guys agree, but if that's good, I'm glad to continue it, because it's also a learning science book. So okay, cool.
All right.
Well, good. Thanks, and take care. We'll see you next week, hopefully.
All right, sounds great. Bye, Clark.
Bye-bye.